Hey, special educators. Welcome to Teach, Taskbox, Inspire, the podcast dedicated to making your job as a special education teacher easier by making your instruction more fun for you and your students. Inside each episode, you'll learn how to get the most use out of your task boxes in the classroom. I'm your host, Lisa Holliday from Chalkboard Superhero, a veteran special education teacher passionate about empowering you with purposeful teaching strategies, helpful tips and tricks, and other classroom management tools that will help you thrive in your role. Let's get started with today's episode. Hey there, special educators, and welcome back to another episode of Teach, Taskbox, Inspire. I'm your host, Lisa Holliday, and today we're tackling a topic that is essential for fostering independence in our students: intentionally fading prompts. Knowing how and when to fade prompts is a skill that can transform your teaching practice and empower your students. So why is prompt fading so important? Prompts are a powerful tool to teach new skills, but if we rely on them for too long, we risk creating dependent students. The ultimate goal is independence, and fading prompts strategically helps students build confidence and ownership of their learning. Even if you have paraprofessionals in your classroom, they also have to know when to fade prompts, right? Prompts come in so many forms: physical, verbal, gestural, visual, and even modeling. Each type has a hierarchy from most intrusive to least intrusive. Understanding this hierarchy allows us to plan how we want to fade them effectively. For example, a verbal prompt might gradually shift into a visual cue before being removed altogether. All right, so let's talk about strategies for fading these prompts. You want to start with the least intrusive prompt. I want you to begin with the least amount of assistance needed. For example, if a student can follow a visual schedule without verbal prompts, don't add unnecessary steps. Then I want you to use prompt hierarchies. I talk about this in previous episodes if you want to go back and listen, but have a plan for reducing assistance. I have a huge prompt hierarchy poster on my walls that I just point to, and we kind of go through one after the next. If we start at the top, work your way to the bottom, and so forth. So for example, if you move from a physical prompt to a gestural one and then to a visual cue, you're kind of moving through that prompt hierarchy. So for example, if you have a student who needs assistance with moving from one center to the next and following their visual schedule, a full physical prompt is you would guide their body. So you're kind of taking their hand and their body, you're walking over to that visual schedule, you're pointing to that visual schedule, you're taking their hand, you're kind of pulling it off with them, you're moving throughout their classroom and kind of guiding their whole body. That is a full physical prompt. You don't want to live there forever, though. You do want them to check their schedule all by themselves. So the next time that you do it, maybe you back off of the full physical and just give them partial physical prompts. So maybe you're just tapping their shoulder, tapping their back, tapping their elbow, and so forth to try to just get them to that visual schedule and to check their schedule. And then from there, maybe you're just tapping the picture so they know what to look for. Maybe after that, you are just pointing to the schedule from across the room saying, check your schedule. And so you want to slowly fade your prompts. Fading prompts is systematic. If you're using verbal prompts, try reducing the frequency or the volume over time. Get it down to a whisper. In my classroom, I try not to use verbal prompts at all because kids so often rely on verbal prompts, and verbal prompts to me have been the hardest to fade. All right, the next one, I really want you to monitor and adjust. Watch for signs of frustration or success. If a student is struggling, you're going to want to jump in and kind of give them more support temporarily, though. But also, struggling is okay. If they struggle, just wait a second. See if they fix or, solve the problem on their own. But then you can jump in and provide more support temporarily. But if they're excelling, consider fading that prompt sooner. Back off. And don't be afraid to tell your paraprofessionals to back off as well. Like, okay, Kelly, can you back off from, so-and-so child? Johnny really can do this all by himself. You also want to reinforce that independence, so celebrate and reward attempts at completing tasks all by themselves, even if they're not perfect. So if you're working on Sarah getting all of her stuff out of her locker into the desk all by herself, without that support, if she can do one of those steps, tell her, I'm so proud that you were able to do that on your own. You also want to, you guessed it, data track. So I want you to keep track of how often prompts are being used and faded. This really helps guide your approach and ensures that you're fading effectively. So many times I've gone into classrooms and saw that they're still using hand-over-hand support. And I'll ask the teacher, how long have they been using that support with that child? The teacher doesn't know. The paraprofessional doesn't know. And oftentimes when I pull that para aside and I say, how long has Rachel been using that prompt for? And they're like, this is the only prompt I know how to use. I don't know any other prompt. That tells me that there is a lack of teaching from the teacher saying, okay, we really need some professional development in here on how to use different types of prompts. And not only that, but how to fade them. Because if they're using a hand-over-hand prompt, that child got super dependent on the adult. That means that they can't do anything independently. So we really want to be sure that we are fading the prompts. Or sometimes I come in and say, oh yeah, we've kind of faded those into gestural prompts, but we can't get away from that. Well, where's the plan? Tell me where the plan is to kind of fade those prompts. Because the longer that these students are using the prompts, that means you're going to have students in high school still depending on adults. And guess what? These kids are going to graduate and go out into the real world without an adult. They have to be using these skills without adults. I always tell my paraprofessionals, we are working you out of a job. I do not want any of my students to be using their paraprofessionals that often. We want them to be independent. All right, so one of my students needed a physical prompt to start her morning routine all of the time. We began by moving to like a gestural prompt, pointing to the next step instead of physically prompting her every time. We always had to walk over to her and say, okay, Rachel, I tapped her on the shoulder, on the back. Okay, it's time to start. Instead of that, we kind of faded to that gestural prompt. So we would just point to the next step on the paper. We wouldn't say anything. We would just come over and kind of tap the paper. A few weeks after that, we introduced a visual schedule. And eventually, Rachel was able to complete her routine independently and did it with so much pride. She smiled. We no longer had to tap her shoulder, her back. We didn't have to use a verbal prompt and say, Rachel, it's time to get started. We didn't have to come over and point to the first step. She was able to do this independently. Another example is I had a student, let's call her Amy, who often needed verbal prompts for letter formation. We started reducing that verbal prompt by adding visual cues on her desk and giving her extra time to process. Over time, she began completing those writing tasks independently with so little assistance. So you want to make sure that you have a plan in place for each student who is overly dependent on these prompts, right? And you want to also make sure that, think about this, sit down and actually think today. Do my paraprofessionals know how to fade the prompt? Let's go back a step. Do they even know the different types of prompts? And then ask yourself, do they know how to fade them? That might be a whole nother lesson inside your head. Okay, I really need to set aside time to do just that. Then I want you to write a plan down. Okay, Amy is super hand over hand, adult prompt dependent, right? Let's make a plan for her to fade that prompt for this and then go from there. So remember that every student is unique. So if a student struggles, don't hesitate to kind of reintroduce a previously faded prompt temporarily while you're building that confidence up. Fading prompts is a process that requires intentionality and patience. It's not going to happen overnight. And celebrate every step towards that independence, no matter how small. Remember, the goal isn't perfection. It's just progress. You want to see progress month over month over month. So by the time next year happens, they're not using those same prompts. All right, that wraps up today's episode of Teach, Task Box, Inspire. Fading prompts requires you to kind of take a deep breath, understand the needs of your students, and kind of make a plan. If this episode resonated with you, please share it and leave a review. Let's keep growing and supporting each other in this incredible journey of special education. I'll see you next week, guys. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Teach, Task Box, Inspire. I hope you've gained some tips and motivation to fuel your week ahead. If you're ready to explore more strategies for empowering your students as independent learners, be sure to dive into my free training at chalkboardsuperhero.com/training. And don't keep all this knowledge to yourself. Share this episode with your special education teacher friends who could use some motivation and inspiration. One more thing before you go. If you're finding this podcast helpful and want to show support, head to Apple Podcasts and leave your rating and review. Until next time, keep teaching, task boxing, and inspiring.